Hello, and welcome to episode 2 of What Is. This episode is all about the Sega Saturn, a system that fell by the wayside in North America and Europe, but fared a little better in Japan. The development of the Sega Saturn began sometime in 1992, and while it was almost done in 1993, it was held back from release because of the Sony PlayStation. Sega saw that Sony's upcoming console had some major advantages over their own, so they changed the Saturn's design to include another display processor to improve its texture mapping and 2D performance. This is where some major issues between Sega of America and Sega of Japan began. Sega of America were not happy with the proposed architecture of the Saturn and fought against it. They even went so far as to broker a deal with Silicon Graphics, who then went on to work with Nintendo for the N64 instead after Sega of Japan refused to budge. There were even talks of a Sony and Sega collaboration by the American sides of those companies, but that obviously didn't happen. During the development of the Saturn, the upcoming 64-bit Atari Jaguar was looming, which worried Sega of Japan's president Hayao Nakayama, and that led to the development of the 32X as essentially a stopgap before the launch of the Saturn. This is rather hilarious in hindsight considering how badly the Jaguar failed, and what a waste of time the 32X was. As Scott Bayless, senior producer at Sega of America at the time, put it, "There's an old bit of racing wisdom. What's behind me doesn't matter." At least at an institutional level, Sega seemed to be living the exact opposite. Strategically, we always seemed to be focusing on what the other guy was doing instead of inventing the future as we saw it. Clearly, some big cracks were beginning to form in the foundation at Sega, and consumers noticed. Not only had Sega pushed out the Mega CD earlier, they had released another dud in the 32X a mere 6 months before the Saturn hit. If you had took the plunge and got a 32X, you essentially had Sega telling you to dump it and get a Saturn instead. Way to inspire consumer confidence, guys. This made the rifts between the regional branches of Sega even worse. The Japanese market had basically ignored the Mega Drive in favor of the PC Engine and Super Famicom, so hardly anyone cared about the 32X. And Sega of Japan focused almost entirely on the Saturn, which didn't go so well for Sega of America and Europe because now they had to contend with a pretty major brand split. So not only do you have these divisions having to split their resources between two systems at once, Sega of Japan's architectural decisions came back to bite them on the ass. The Saturn is an absolute powerhouse when it comes to 2D graphics, but the 3D was weak, and guess who had a system that was great at 3D? Sure, the 3D graphics on the PlayStation are poor by today's standards, but Sony clearly figured out which way the wind was blowing and made sure their system was built for the technology. Not only did Sony have this advantage, they also made sure to help third-party developers make games on their system as easily as possible. The Saturn was way behind in this regard. Their complex Frankenstein system was difficult to develop for, particularly at launch, and their development tools weren't very good. This hurt the Saturn in a big way at its launch, and it never really recovered. The system lasted a mere 4 years in North America and Europe, while it stuck around an extra 2 in Japan. This wasn't the beginning of the end, nor the actual end for Sega as a hardware manufacturer, but it's a big part of its demise. The weird part about the Sega Saturn is that while it's generally considered a failure, it has one of the best libraries of games out there. It is certainly lacking in 3D games and genres like RPGs, but it has a robust fighting, puzzle, shoot-'em-up, and visual novel library. With the Ramcart add-on, there are even arcade-perfect ports of certain games available. Okay, to be truthful, a lot of the best releases were Japan only, but it's still well worth the import as so many of the titles are easily playable without knowing Japanese. Of course, a lot of them are expensive as hell, even in Japan, but what can you do? Let's just check some of them out. you want to collect for the Saturn, it's fairly easy to do so in general. The Sega Saturn does have a region lockout, so you'll have to either get import systems to play certain games, or a mod chip, which is somewhat iffy legally and only works on certain models. Besides the system, you'll also likely want to find a working save cart, RAM cart, and maybe peripherals like a fight stick or 3D controllers. As there isn't any region locking on these items, I highly recommend seeking out Japanese peripherals, as they are way cheaper and easier to find. Also, you can get wacky things like this. Once you get into the games, you'll quickly find out that the prices range from extremely cheap to ridiculously expensive, as well as the fact that the Japanese versions are generally cheaper than the North American ones. European releases tend to fall in between, but are a bit scarcer online. I don't know if this has to do with their actual rarity or European sellers using sites I'm unfamiliar with. Now, the best places to find Japanese games used to be at junk shops. These were shops filled to the brim with all sorts of retro games for really cheap. Unfortunately, this market has shifted quite a bit, and you're not going to be able to find games as cheaply as you could about 10 years ago. The next best places to look are Yahoo Japan auctions, with the use of a buying service, and eBay. There are actually numerous sellers on eBay that are very affordable, so it's worth checking them out. eBay is also generally the go-to place for all the North American releases as well. You might find games at garage sales, flea markets, and local game stores, but I have found Saturn games to be scarcer in general, and the really good stuff hardly ever appears outside of online. So to wrap this up, I'll say that in hindsight, it's clear that Sega made a lot of poor choices before, during, and after the development of the Saturn that ended their hardware manufacturing days. I feel they really should have seen some of this coming, but with the disorganization and lack of vision from the Japanese division, it's not terribly surprising that the ship wasn't righted in time. What is surprising is that the Saturn managed to eke out what it did, and that Sega managed to get the Dreamcast out afterwards at all. It's an interesting thought exercise to think about how much more the Saturn could have done if it had been as successful as the PlayStation, but alas, we will never get to know. At least we got some pretty sweet games to play, despite everything though. And that was the Sega Saturn. Let me know what you think of it in the comments below. Don't forget to check out all my social media and my Patreon, and I'll see you guys next time.